Respected Vice President, Honorable Home Minister, dear colleagues, fellow authors, friends. It's a great privilege to be a contributor to this volume that marks 20 years in government of Sri Narendra Modi ji. I have obviously contributed on the foreign policy impact that he's had over the last 8 years. And in doing so, tried to trace the influence of his Gujarat years on his foreign policy. And what I present really from the analysis of these 8 years are the new concepts, the aspirations, the vision, the strategy that he has brought to bear in this domain. Perhaps the right starting point for my remarks today would be my first encounter with him. And this was 10 years ago, 11 years ago, November 2011. I was ambassador in China, and he was the Chief Minister of Gujarat, visiting China, as many Chief Ministers did at that time. And we were used in the embassy to Chief Ministers. But this one was very different. It was very different because he arrived after midnight. He wanted his first briefing meeting at 7 o'clock in the morning. He ran a 12-hour day with a half-an-hour lunch break. And he proceeded to cover 3 cities, I think, in 4 days. And of course, today, this is standard operating procedure for all of us. But at that time, it was a discovery. And it wasn't just a grueling schedule which I recall from that visit. He did something very unusual as Chief Minister. He asked me to brief him on our security posture vis-à-vis China. At that time, we were having problems. Some of you may recall stapled visas, border map projections, and the terrorism. And the point he made was, I may be Chief Minister of Gujarat, but I'm a citizen of India. When I go outside, I will not be 1 millimeter different from what is our national stance. The second was, again, Chief Ministers typically come to promote their states, but he was worried about the economic imbalance between India and China. And the third recollection I have, 11 years ago, we had some Indian citizens, they happened to be jewelers from Gujarat, who were in prison in China at that time. And he was very concerned about getting them released. Now, I remember those 3 aspects because in a way, I would say they were my first outline of what his thinking was about foreign policy. And today, when I look at what is the difference that he has made, he has really led a foreign policy which is much more security focused. He has practiced a diplomacy which is more development focused. He has created people-centric policies in foreign policy. And he has run a foreign policy of a civilizational state. So let me very quickly fast forward 8 years and run through each of these 4 themes. National security emphasis. The 8 years of Modi Sarkar has brought terrorism fair square at the center of the global debate. And he has concentrated on developing the border infrastructure because he knows that is essential to meet our security challenges. So it could be Uri and Balakot, it could be Doklam and Ladakh. But you can see today, this is not a country that shies away from its hard security challenges. Let me talk about diplomacy for development. I think if you look in terms of his efforts to get capital, technology, best practices from the world, the interest that he takes in trade, he actually addressed every one of our embassies in pursuit of a goal of reaching $400 billion of exports. the effort which he makes to woo funds so that their investment in India generates employment. When he goes abroad, he looks at railways, he looks at EVs, he looks at environment, green projects, with a view of what is it he can take back to India. So it is very much that quest for development is very much at the heart of what he does abroad. As for being people-centric, I think each one of you will know how much easier it is today to get a passport, how he has cut through layers of bureaucracy, made it so much simpler. How he actually imagined that we would use post offices who in this day and age were less relevant, as passport collection centers. A very good example actually of minimum government, maximum governance. And in terms of the people centricity, I think you saw the Vande Bharat mission during the COVID. Operation Ganga, which was referred to, Operation Devi Shakti, that today an Indian going abroad knows that we have their back. That in whatever situation of distress, we are there for them. And that is a huge change in the country's profile, in the confidence that citizens have about us, and in the view that the world has about us. And this is also reflected in his diaspora policies, in his Diaspora Connect, beginning with Madison Square Garden. In fact, in my chapter, I describe what was the conversation we had, which led to the Madison Square Garden program. And our effort today at migration and mobility agreements so that our people can work abroad, because Prime Minister Modi sees the world not just as a marketplace, but as a global workplace. And a lot of his foreign policy efforts are in that direction. And finally, the cultural side. I think the projection of India, I think he's a quintessentially Indian persona who is today, his presence on the world stage, I think, projects India in a manner that is very difficult to describe. But it is reflected in initiatives on the International Day of Yoga, on the propagation of Ayurveda. In fact, even on an assertion that we are not just followers of democracy, we are actually owners of democracy. In many ways, we are founders of democracy. It is deep in our culture. Our pluralism is actually one of the traditions, one of the histories on the basis of which democracy has developed. So these, to my mind, are the big changes which have happened, as I said, not just in these 8 years, but in the years preceding those where they struck roots. But I also see them reflected in greater conceptual clarity, in the idea of a non-reciprocal generous neighborhood policy, in the idea of an ocean space, a Sagar policy, where we are the first responders, in extended neighborhoods, whether it is the Gulf, Southeast Asia, or Central Asia, in an independent and confident posture in the world, where we can engage all the major powers on our terms, knowing our interests and getting our outcomes, and in expanding our global footprint. I can also assert with a great deal of evidence that he has shaped global agenda. Again, some of it goes back to the Gujarat years, the interest in solar, for example, which has led to the Solar Alliance today. His earthquake recovery efforts, which has created the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. His emphasis on putting black money, terrorism, digital, SDGs on the global agenda. So here is a Prime Minister who has actually propagated and practiced a policy of India first. India first, not as India versus the world, but India first, with India at the center of his perspective and his outlook. And that is his ability actually to harmonize India and the world is exactly what led him to undertake the Vaccine Maitri initiative. So to sum up, the chapter that I have in the book actually lays out what I would say, is the paradox of Narendra Modi. A visionary, but a person of great detail. A culturally steeped person, very deep in our heritage, but a great modernizer. A very strong nationalist, but a very believing internationalist. So, as they said, happy reading.
बहुत बहुत